Chapter 1. The Midnight Alarm. Inspector Price arrived at the British Admiralty's headquarters just past 11 o'clock, summoned by a cryptic, urgent telegram that had reached him earlier in the evening. There had been no time for pleasantries or explanations, just the barest of details. The disappearance of highly sensitive naval plans, a breach of national security, and the need for immediate action. The door to the archive was opened to him by a nervous-looking constable, his face pale in the dim light. Inside, the scene was one of disarray, but with a cold, calculated feel. Nothing about it appeared hurried, but everything about it suggested precision. Someone had meticulously ransacked the vault, searching for something specific. Commander Henry Whitlock stood by the ransacked vault, his arms folded behind his back. The man's stern features and military bearing left little room for subtlety or diplomacy. Whitlock's uniform was perfectly pressed, his demeanour cold and methodical, but there was an edge to his eyes that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, resplendent in an evening dress that clung to her elegant frame, paced nearby. Despite the late hour, there was an air of unaffected grace about her, though her well-manicured hands trembled ever so slightly. Known for her philanthropic efforts, Lady Eleanor was a frequent guest in the highest echelons of society, with more than a few whispers of scandal following her wherever she went. She was certainly a woman of mystery, always in the right place at the right time. At the far end of the room, Mr. Alfred Grayson, a senior archivist with more than 2 decades of service to the Admiralty, meticulously examined the damaged lock of the vault. His spectacles caught the low light, giving him a scholarly yet dishevelled appearance. Grayson was known for his obsessiveness over detail, and his reluctance to deviate from established routine made him an enigma. He had a reputation for being brilliant in his work, but how much of that brilliance extended to his personal life remained unknown. Mr. Rupert Henshaw, a parliamentary aide in his mid-30s, stood at the far corner of the room, nervously adjusting his tie. His lean frame seemed too casual for the circumstances, but Price had learned to never underestimate appearances. A man of words, Henshaw was known for his political manoeuvring, a man adept at navigating the treacherous waters of Parliament with a charm that masked his calculating nature. In an institution like the Admiralty, his presence raised more than a few eyebrows. Why would a parliamentary aide have access to naval archives? I trust you are all aware of the seriousness of the situation. Price's voice cut through the tense air. He surveyed the 4 suspects with a steady, piercing gaze. His tone was calm, deliberate, but beneath it simmered the unmistakable edge of a man used to solving the most complex of puzzles. Commander Whitlock nodded stiffly, but there was something in his gaze that spoke volumes. The plans are vital, Inspector. Without them, we're exposed. Our enemies will know our every move before we can make it. Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered to the floor for just a moment, her lips pressed together in a thin line. The summit is in just days, Inspector. If this leak reaches the wrong hands, I shudder to think of the consequences. Henshaw shifted nervously, clearing his throat. If I may, sir. It's clear someone with inside knowledge of the vault's security was involved. There was no sign of forced entry. Whoever took the plans knew exactly where to look. Price's gaze hardened. Indeed. Which means we are dealing with someone who has both access and motive. No outsider could have done this, not without drawing attention. It had to be someone who was already here. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping over each of the 4 suspects, his mind already working through the possible connections, the webs of secrecy they might be hiding. Whitlock's military background, Eleanor's high society connections, Grayson's knowledge of the vaults, and Henshaw's ties to Parliament. All of them had reasons to be involved, whether they knew it or not. The vault was a masterpiece of security, hidden behind layers of locks, codes, and an intricate system of guards. Yet there were no signs of a struggle, no forced locks, no broken windows. The plans were simply gone. Someone had been able to slip in, bypassing all security, with the ease of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Price turned back to face the group. "I'll need a full accounting of each of your whereabouts in the hours before the plans went missing. Let's start with you, Commander. You had access to the vault, did you not?" Whitlock stiffened, but his answer was measured. "Yes, Inspector. As part of my duties overseeing the fleet's readiness, I often visit the archive. I assure you I would never jeopardize the security of this nation." Lady Eleanor gave a small, barely perceptible laugh, though it lacked humor. "I'm sure the commander is quite capable, Inspector, but let's not forget that some of us have been trusted with far more than just naval matters." Price's eyes narrowed as he turned to her. "Lady Eleanor, your name appears in the records as a frequent visitor. You've made several donations to the Admiralty over the years. Surely you can understand my skepticism in these circumstances." Her lips tightened, but she did not speak further. Grayson cleared his throat nervously. I was here earlier in the evening reviewing some classified files. It's routine, but the vault was secure when I left. I can assure you of that." Price turned to Henshaw, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "Mr. Henshaw, your ties to Parliament are well known. You were granted access, I believe, due to your work with the Admiralty's naval budgets?" Henshaw nodded quickly, adjusting his tie again. "Yes, but I had no reason to involve myself with the vault, Inspector. I don't even know what was in the plans." Price said nothing for a long moment, his gaze lingering on each of them. The truth, he knew, was there, hidden beneath layers of deception, lies, and half-truths. Finally he spoke. "One of you is responsible for this theft, but no one is going anywhere until I've got to the bottom of this." Chapter 2. Secrets Behind the Admiralty Doors. The next morning, a biting fog enveloped London, blanketing the Admiralty with a chill that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. Inspector Price walked through the corridors with purpose. He was determined to uncover the truth, and began his series of interviews in the Admiralty's private study, a dimly lit room furnished with mahogany panels and heavy leather chairs, a place where difficult conversations often took place behind closed doors. Today it was the setting for his first round of questioning, where each suspect would face him under the weight of his relentless scrutiny. Commander Henry Whitlock's interview was first on Price's list. The commander's military bearing seemed unshaken as he stood before the inspector, his broad shoulders squared and his gaze steady. The inspector wasted no time getting to the point. "Commander Whitlock," he began, "you mentioned last night that you had an argument with Admiral Tennyson regarding the secrecy of the new battleship project. What was the nature of this disagreement?" Whitlock's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he took a moment before responding. "It was nothing, really. A difference of opinion about the level of confidentiality required for such a project. I wanted tighter security, but the Admiral—" He paused and sighed. He felt it was already sufficient. "We've had these disagreements before. Nothing unusual." Price studied him closely. The commander's words were measured, but Price's trained ear caught a subtle hesitation in his voice. "And yet," Price continued, "the plans are now missing. You must see how that looks. Is it possible that in your disagreement, your emotions got the better of you?" Whitlock's eyes flashed. I would never jeopardize national security, Inspector. I have served this country for years, and I— He stopped himself abruptly, clearly frustrated at the accusation. I assure you I had nothing to do with it. Price let the silence hang for a moment, allowing Whitlock's words to settle in the room. Very well. But you were one of the few with access to the vault. Did you happen to notice anything unusual in the days leading up to the disappearance? The commander shifted uncomfortably but shook his head. No, nothing unusual. I did my job. That's all. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft was next. When she entered the room, she was every inch the epitome of aristocratic elegance, draped in a deep green velvet dress that shimmered subtly under the room's dim light. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, met Price's with a steady gaze, yet there was something guarded about her demeanour, an almost imperceptible coolness in her politeness. Lady Ashcroft, your recent gala was attended by many foreign dignitaries. Price began. Can you recall anyone who may have shown interest in the plans? Perhaps someone who might have had an ulterior motive for being at such an event? Her lips curved into a polite smile. I'm afraid I do not see the connection, Inspector. The gala was a charitable affair, not the place for matters of national security. As for the plans, I have no knowledge of them. I am only an occasional visitor to the Admiralty for various philanthropic causes. Price observed her closely, noting the faintest tremor in her hands as she clasped them together in her lap. Her eyes, while calm, seemed to flicker briefly when he mentioned the gala. It was subtle but unmistakable. You're certain no one at the gala showed any particular interest in the naval projects, Lady Ashcroft? Price pressed. Your connections in high society, people of influence, could easily have found ways to access such sensitive information. Her gaze hardened just for a moment. I told you, Inspector, I am no conspirator. You are grasping at straws. But Price wasn't convinced. He had seen how she deflected his questions, each answer coming too quickly, too smoothly. It was a tactic he knew well, one that attempted to cover up something more than what was being said. Alfred Grayson, the archivist, sat with his back perfectly straight, his spectacles glinting under the lamplight. His fingers fidgeted slightly with the edge of his collar, but otherwise, he appeared composed. Mr. Grayson, Price began, you've worked at the Admiralty for years. Surely you've encountered security breaches or strange incidents before. What do you think happened here? Grayson's voice was steady. I cannot say, Inspector. The vault was secure when I left, I can assure you. I would never leave it vulnerable. My work is meticulous. Price noted the slight crack in Grayson's calm demeanour. The man's hands trembled, betraying him in a way his words did not. You're certain, Mr. Grayson, Price continued. You say you left the vault secure, but there were no signs of forced entry. Do you think someone else had access? Grayson shifted in his seat, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. I don't know what happened. I locked it up properly. I always do. Rupert Henshaw, the parliamentary aide, was the last to be interviewed. He was dressed in an immaculate suit, his posture casual as he lounged in the chair opposite Price. The man exuded confidence, perhaps too much. Mr. Henshaw, Price began, you've been involved in the Admiralty's budget discussions. The naval project's costs have been a subject of controversy recently. Could that have been a factor in the theft? Henshaw scoffed, a flicker of disdain crossing his features. Inspector, I have no patience for wasteful spending, but I would hardly go to such lengths over a few extra pounds. The theft is as much a mystery to me as it is to you. Perhaps, however, someone more invested in the project's outcome had something to gain from it. Price's eyes narrowed. You dismiss the possibility too easily, Mr. Henshaw. But I noticed you didn't deny knowing about the expense issues. Is it possible you felt the project's cost was too high for the good of the nation? Henshaw's smile faltered, though he quickly recovered. It's not for me to say. My job is to ensure Parliament's interests are represented, and the rest is none of my concern. As the interviews concluded, Price leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning with the inconsistencies in their stories. Each of them had motives, and each of them had a reason to be involved in the theft, whether it was out of personal gain, political maneuvering, or secrecy. The question was not who had access, but who had the most to gain, and that, Price knew, would take a deeper dive into the shadows of each suspect's life.
Chapter 3. A Bolt from the East. The fog that had once hung heavy over London now felt like a distant memory. At the Admiralty, the atmosphere inside was thick with the pressure of the investigation. Inspector Price paced in front of his desk, the weight of the stolen plans bearing down on him as he sifted through the latest reports. His mind was racing with the growing realization that this was no ordinary theft. It was a well-orchestrated conspiracy, and there were far more players involved than he had originally imagined. It had started with an intercepted message. A cryptic cable, received at the Admiralty in the early hours of the morning, was marked with a level of urgency that immediately caught the attention of the cryptographers. The message, in code, had been quickly decoded. It was brief, yet chilling. The plans will be in the hands of the East before the summit. Do not attempt to interfere. Your leaders will regret it. Price had read the message more than once, his brow furrowed in deep thought. Bolshevik involvement. The possibility of foreign influence was not something he had considered, but now, with this new information, it seemed all but certain. The theft was no longer just about secret naval plans. It was about a political maneuver, a covert operation with international implications. He had learned that the Bolshevik movement, with its growing influence in Russia, had been actively seeking to destabilize Europe, and now it seemed they had found an ally within the heart of Britain's own security apparatus. Price's pulse quickened as he scanned the document once more. But this was no time to dwell on suspicions. There was work to be done. And the first place to start was the suspect who had raised his own suspicions from the very beginning, Alfred Grayson. Grayson's residence was tucked away in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood in South London. He knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness of the early afternoon. After a moment, the door creaked open to reveal Grayson's housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with a tired expression. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Webb," Price said, flashing his identification. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Grayson." The housekeeper looked uneasy, her eyes darting toward the hallway behind her. "Mr. Grayson is at home, Inspector. He's in the study, but I must warn you, he's not in the best of spirits today. He's been rather distracted." Price nodded, understanding. He had seen Grayson's unease during the interview at the Admiralty, but this would be different. Now, in the quiet of his own home, there would be no distractions to mask the truth. As he entered, the study was dimly lit, its walls lined with bookshelves that held countless volumes of naval history, archives, and records. However, what immediately caught Price's attention was a small corner of the room that seemed out of place. On a side table, next to a well-worn leather armchair, was a collection of books, seemingly untouched by time, their titles written in Cyrillic. Price's eyes narrowed. Russian literature. The titles appeared to be from the works of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Pushkin, but they were not just any books. Some were heavily annotated in a way that suggested a deeper, more intimate knowledge of their contents. A Russian scholar, perhaps. But why would an archivist at the Admiralty possessed such a collection. Before he could inquire further, Grayson entered the room, looking disheveled and exhausted. His usually tidy appearance had been replaced by a rumpled suit and unkempt hair. He had clearly not been expecting a visit. "Inspector," he greeted, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "What brings you here?" "I trust you don't mind my stopping by, Mr. Grayson," Price said, his tone casual but sharp. "I've come across something that I think you should explain." Grayson's gaze flickered to the table where the Russian books lay, and his face tightened. He quickly moved to the side, as if to block Price's view. "That collection is just a personal interest of mine," Grayson said, his voice too defensive. "I've always had an interest in literature, particularly the works of Russian authors. It's not unusual for a man of my intellect to indulge in such matters." Price's eyes remained fixed on the books, noting their uncharacteristic position. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "but your collection seems particularly focused on Russian revolutionary thought. You've read some of these works carefully, perhaps a little too carefully." Grayson stiffened, his lips pressing into a tight line. "I assure you, Inspector, there's nothing sinister about it. I simply appreciate the literary value of their works. The revolution itself is a matter for history, not for me." Price watched him carefully. "How do you explain," Price continued, "the intercepted message from the Bolsheviks, the one that mentions plans being smuggled to the East? It seems a curious coincidence, don't you think? Your collection of Russian literature, your access to classified documents. Could there be a connection?" Grayson's face paled, and he faltered. I don't know what you mean, Inspector. I've been a loyal servant to the Admiralty for over 20 years. I would never betray my country." Price didn't believe him, but he knew he needed to gather more evidence before making any accusations. "Of course, Mr. Grayson," the inspector said, standing and adjusting his coat. "But I will be back. And when I do, I expect more than just empty assurances." Meanwhile, back at the Admiralty, Price's investigation took another unexpected turn. It was Lady Eleanor Ashcroft who had once again caught his attention. Her alibi had been unconvincing, and her connection to high society, coupled with her recent philanthropic efforts, seemed to position her perfectly in a wider web of political intrigue. Price's team had uncovered something new in her correspondence. Letters exchanged with none other than Count Alexei Volkov, a Russian ambassador with known ties to the Bolshevik movement. The letters, sent over the past several months, discussed cultural matters, exhibitions, sponsorships, and charitable causes. But they also hinted at something darker: discussions of restructuring and securing new alliances. The language was subtle, coded in a way that would not immediately raise suspicions, but the more Price examined the letters, the more he began to see a pattern. It was clear that Lady Ashcroft had been involved with far more than just social events. Whether she was directly involved in the plot to steal the naval plans or simply caught in the crossfire of a larger political game remained to be told. The stolen plans were being smuggled out of the country. Price could feel it in his bones. The question was no longer whether the Bolsheviks were involved, but how deep the conspiracy ran. He had to act quickly. The summit was approaching, and time was running out.
Chapter 4. The Shadow of Treachery. The days seemed to blur together as Price's investigation into the stolen naval plans deepened. Every lead seemed to take him in a new direction, each more treacherous than the last. The stakes had escalated beyond the theft of military secrets. It was now a game of espionage, deception, and hidden allegiances. Price knew that to uncover the truth, he would need to do something daring. The suspects were clever, each one hiding behind layers of deception, but Price had learned that there was one thing that could unravel even the tightest of secrets: fear. He devised a plan to expose the guilty party, a carefully constructed false lead, a bit of misdirection designed to set the trap. If any of the suspects had ties to foreign agents, he was certain they would react, and he would be watching. It was late in the afternoon when he set the wheels of his plan into motion. He orchestrated a subtle leak to the press. Nothing overt, just a rumor spread through discreet channels. The word was that a meeting had been scheduled involving a select group of naval engineers, a handful of the brightest minds working on the Admiralty's most sensitive projects. The supposed meeting would take place in a quiet, unassuming location on the outskirts of London, far from prying eyes. Price ensured that the information reached the right ears, the suspects. If any of them were involved in the theft or connected to foreign agents, they would take the bait. The reactions came swiftly. Commander Whitlock was the first to respond, though his reaction was not exactly what Price had expected. The man's typically stoic expression faltered for just a moment when he heard the rumor. His eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched, but he said nothing at first. A few minutes later, Price watched from a discreet vantage point as Whitlock stormed into the Admiralty's conference room, his military composure shattered. Price could see the man arguing heatedly with a few officers, his gestures exaggerated and defensive. Clearly, Whitlock didn't take kindly to the suggestion of a secret meeting, though whether it was genuine concern or a calculated attempt to distance himself from the rumor, Price couldn't say. Next, Lady Eleanor Ashcroft's reaction was far subtler, but far more revealing. Price saw her in the lobby of a high society tea house, her usual poised demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic air of discomfort. She glanced at the papers in front of her, her fingers tapping nervously against the china teacup, and she seemed almost disconnected from the conversation around her. Price couldn't help but notice how she stiffened when the name of the naval engineers was mentioned in passing by a neighbouring patron. For a woman who was always the centre of attention, the fact that she shrank from such trivial gossip was telling. Lady Ashcroft was not one to shy away from anything, least of all a bit of news involving high-ranking officials. It seemed as though the rumour unnerved her, or worse, maybe she was afraid of what might come to light. Alfred Grayson, ever the meticulous archivist, responded to the fabricated information with a nearly invisible reaction. Price observed him from across the room in the Admiralty's study, where Grayson was engrossed in his work. The moment he overheard the gossip about the meeting, Grayson froze, his hand hovering in mid-air over a stack of files. But rather than showing concern or curiosity, he simply resumed his work without further comment, avoiding the subject entirely. His complete disinterest only made Price more suspicious. It was almost as though Grayson knew nothing about the meeting because it wasn't meant for him to know. Could it be that he had already been briefed on the true nature of things? Or was he trying to feign innocence? Either way, Grayson was playing his part too carefully. Finally, Rupert Henshaw, the ambitious parliamentary aide, was the most obvious in his response. Henshaw, who had been lounging casually at a nearby pub, immediately perked up when the conversation turned to the naval engineers and their supposed clandestine meeting. He leaned in, asking questions with the subtlety of a man who had little regard for discretion. His wide-eyed eagerness to learn more, his desire to know every detail was far too intense to be just casual curiosity. Price had seen enough men like Henshaw, people who thought they could play both sides, working from the shadows with the hope of leveraging the information to their advantage. Price's instincts told him that Henshaw was far too invested in this meeting, especially considering his usual disinterest in naval affairs. He was looking for something, hoping that the meeting would reveal more than just an engineering discussion. Perhaps Henshaw saw it as a chance to gain power, or perhaps his interest ran deeper. Either way, his reaction was a clear sign that he was hiding something. With the trap now set and the reactions confirmed, Price felt a gnawing certainty in his gut. He didn't need more proof to know that at least one of the suspects was involved in something far more dangerous. The inspector decided his next move. He would follow Grayson. The archivist's strange indifference to the fabricated meeting had been too telling. If Grayson had nothing to hide, he would have shown some interest, some reaction. But the man had remained calm, almost eerily so. The following evening, Price shadowed Grayson through the misty streets of London. He kept his distance, moving through the crowd with practiced ease, careful not to attract attention. Grayson, unaware of his tale, took a circuitous route, his movements deliberate and cautious. Price had been following suspects for years, and he knew that Grayson was aware of something. Perhaps he was even meeting someone. The alleyways grew darker, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and fog. Grayson made his way toward an unmarked building at the end of a narrow street. Price paused just out of sight, watching as Grayson knocked on the door in a rhythmic pattern, one that suggested familiarity. The door creaked open almost immediately, revealing a shadowy figure who ushered Grayson inside. But as he approached the door, the atmosphere shifted. Suddenly there was a rustle behind him, a soft footstep, and then a sharp pain in his side. He gasped, stumbling as something heavy struck him across the back of the head. Before he could react, darkness clouded his vision. When Price regained consciousness, his first thought was that he had narrowly escaped death. His head throbbed, and his body ached as he staggered to his feet. He was alone in a dark alley, his coat torn and his pockets rifled through. Whoever had ambushed him hadn't taken his life, but they had sent a clear message. They were watching him, and they wouldn't hesitate to strike again if he got too close. Shaken but resolute, Price adjusted his collar and straightened his coat, knowing that the game had just taken a far more dangerous turn. Someone was willing to kill to keep the truth buried.
Chapter 5. The Hidden Cipher. The pain in Price's head lingered as he awoke the following morning. The memories of the ambush still hazy in his mind. He had barely escaped with his life. But Price wasn't the type to be easily intimidated. He was far more interested in what had happened before the attack, and more importantly, in what he had learned. Grayson's behavior and the false meeting had led him here, and there was still work to be done. The discovery of Grayson's involvement, the hidden messages, and the Bolshevik connections were all pieces of the puzzle. He needed to find the missing links, the fragments that would tie everything together. His first stop was Grayson's office. The archivist's workspace had been untouched since the night of their last meeting. The heavy air in the room still thick with the smell of leather-bound books and paperwork. As he scanned the cluttered desk, his eyes fell upon a small notebook tucked away in a drawer. It wasn't much to look at, old worn leather with no markings, but something about it caught his attention. The notebook didn't belong with the other neat, orderly files. It seemed out of place, as though it had been deliberately hidden. Price carefully picked it up and flipped it open, his eyes narrowing as he saw the entries inside. The handwriting was small, almost illegible in places, but Price could make out enough to understand that this wasn't a normal logbook. The entries were filled with strange references to meetings, dates, and locations. But there was one thing that stood out above all else: the repeated mention of a shadowy group called the Red Hand. At first glance, the notes seemed to be nothing more than vague ramblings, but Price's trained eye could see that they were anything but random. There were coded messages hidden in the lines, references to people and places that were clearly not meant for public eyes. The Red Hand was a Bolshevik operative network, one that Price knew had been working to destabilize Europe for years. The notebook described a series of covert meetings between Grayson and someone named Volkov, likely the same Russian ambassador Lady Ashcroft had corresponded with. They spoke of transporting items across borders, of using secret routes to smuggle people in and out of the country without detection. One line in particular caught his attention. "The plans are ready for transport. The operative in charge will leave with them tomorrow. The meeting will be at the warehouse by the docks." Price's mind immediately clicked into place. The plans, the ones that had been stolen, were likely already in the hands of the Bolsheviks. This was more than just espionage. It was a well-orchestrated operation, one that had been planned for months. He couldn't waste any more time. He had to get to the warehouse. The warehouse district by the docks was gritty and foreboding. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and rust, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of dim light from the overhead lamps. Price's boots echoed off the cobblestones as he moved through the alleyways, his thoughts focused on the notebook's final entry. This warehouse was the key to everything. As he approached the location indicated in the notebook, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was off. There was a faint noise in the distance, a creak of wood, the muffled sound of voices, but it was too quiet. The absence of activity made the place feel like a trap. Still, Price had to check it out. If Grayson and his Bolshevik contacts were here, he needed to know what was going on. He crouched low, moving swiftly and silently toward the large, rusted doors of the warehouse. Peering through a crack, he could just make out a small group of figures standing inside, speaking in hushed tones. There was one person who stood out, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and an air of authority about him. This must have been the Bolshevik operative, the one mentioned in Grayson's notebook. Price slowly reached into his coat pocket for his revolver. He needed to get closer to hear their conversation, but as he moved, his foot caught on something, a loose stone, and it scraped against the ground with a sharp noise. The figures inside froze, their heads turning toward the door in unison. Price cursed under his breath and ducked behind a stack of crates, his heart pounding. His cover was blown. He could hear the footsteps approaching, quick and deliberate. His mind raced as he calculated his next move. There was no way he could make a clean escape now, not without risking everything. But then, a familiar voice broke through the tension. "Inspector Price," the man inside said, his tone cold. "I was hoping you'd come." It was Rupert Henshaw. Price slowly emerged from his hiding spot. The last person he expected to find here was Henshaw. The parliamentary aide had always seemed so eager, so ambitious. Was he really involved in this dangerous game? "What is this, Henshaw?" Price demanded, his voice steady but low. "What's really going on here?" Henshaw smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I'm just following orders, Inspector. You should know how it works by now. Some people have a great deal of influence, and others do their bidding." Price's eyes narrowed. "So you're working for the Bolsheviks?" Henshaw's smirk faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "Not exactly. I'm just a facilitator, a messenger. This," he gestured to the shadows behind him, "is bigger than me. You've seen what they're capable of, but I'm not the mastermind, Price. I'm just the middleman." That was the moment when Price's instincts kicked in. Henshaw was no mastermind. He was a pawn, someone who had been caught up in something far greater than himself. He had been manipulated by people who knew how to use him, just as they had used others. Price pieced the situation together. The stolen plans, the false meeting, the encrypted notebook. It all pointed to a larger network. Grayson, Henshaw, even Lady Ashcroft, none of them were the true masterminds. They were merely part of the machinery, pushed into a game they didn't fully understand. But there was one thing that Price knew for certain. Someone was pulling the strings. Someone with the power to orchestrate this grand scheme. And Price would find them, no matter the cost. As he moved to confront Henshaw, the door to the warehouse creaked open once more, and a second figure entered the dim light. A figure Price recognized immediately. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft. Her presence confirmed his suspicions. She was deeper into this than anyone had realized. The game had just escalated, and there was no turning back. Chapter 6. Unmasking the Traitor. The evening air was sharp and cold as Inspector Price made his way to Lady Eleanor Ashcroft's manor. It was an imposing structure, tucked away in one of the more exclusive neighborhoods of London, far from the prying eyes of the general public. A place where the elite could gather, where politics and high society intersected without consequence. Tonight, it would serve as the stage for Price's final act in unmasking the truth. Price, with the exclusive order of the Scotland Yard, had ordered for this dinner to be orchestrated with careful precision. All of the suspects were invited under the guise of a formal social gathering, a lavish evening to celebrate Lady Ashcroft's latest philanthropic efforts. The guest list was filled with politicians, dignitaries, and influential figures. Perfect cover for the larger plan. Each of the key players, Commander Whitlock, Lady Ashcroft, Alfred Grayson, and Rupert Henshaw, would be there. The time had come to draw the final curtain. Price had gathered enough evidence to reveal the full scope of the conspiracy, and tonight, in the grand dining room of Lady Ashcroft's stately home, he would expose the truth to all. The dinner was a masterpiece of high society elegance. The grand chandelier overhead bathed the room in soft golden light. The long dining table was set with fine china, crystal goblets filled with wine, and silver candelabras that flickered in the glow. Lady Ashcroft played the perfect hostess, her poise unwavering as she moved about the room. Her guests mingled and conversed, unaware of the true nature of the evening. But Price knew that the words he would speak in just a few short hours would shatter the calm facade of wealth and privilege they had so carefully constructed. Price remained quiet, his sharp eyes scanning the room, taking in every subtle shift in posture, every shift in the guest's demeanor. All of the pieces were in place. As the dinner reached its peak, the moment arrived. The clink of silverware faded into silence as the last of the desserts were served, and Lady Ashcroft rose to give a brief speech. It was time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Price began, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the gentle hum of conversation. "I regret to interrupt, but I believe the evening's discussion must take a more serious turn." A hush fell over the room as every eye turned toward him. Price's gaze swept over the faces of the four suspects. Lady Ashcroft stood stiffly, her smile now gone, replaced by a hint of confusion. Commander Whitlock, normally impervious to public scrutiny, seemed uncharacteristically tense, his jaw set in a hard line. Grayson, his hands folded before him, sat rigid in his chair, though his eyes darted nervously. Henshaw's gaze was more calculating, his expression one of mild curiosity, though Price could see the edges of suspicion creeping into his eyes. The inspector took a step forward. "You have all been invited here this evening because you are part of a very serious matter, a matter that goes far beyond the theft of mere naval plans." He allowed the weight of his words to sink in, watching as the guests shifted uneasily in their seats. "I have spent the past several days piecing together the evidence," Price continued, his voice unwavering. "What began as a theft has become a matter of national security, a matter of international conspiracy. The plans for the new battleship, vital to the defense of this nation, were stolen by someone within the Admiralty. But what you don't yet know is that the theft was not just for personal gain. It was orchestrated with the help of foreign agents, specifically Bolshevik operatives." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Commander Whitlock's brow furrowed in confusion, while Henshaw leaned forward. Grayson remained silent, but there was a noticeable shift in his posture. He was watching Price closely now, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his glass. "The evidence I've uncovered points directly to the involvement of one of you," Price continued, his gaze lingering on Lady Ashcroft. "Your connections to high society, your constant social gatherings, and your philanthropy were all a cover for something much more sinister. You have been working with Bolshevik agents, using your galas as a means of communication and coordination. You were the perfect conduit, Lady Ashcroft." Lady Ashcroft stiffened, her mouth tight, her eyes momentarily betraying her calm demeanor. Price saw the flicker of guilt behind her mask before she regained control of her emotions. "Inspector, you have no proof of such wild accusations," she said, her voice smooth, but with an underlying edge. "I have been a loyal servant to this country, and you insult me with your baseless allegations." Price's lips curled into a thin smile. "You may deny it, Lady Ashcroft, but the truth is plain. Your communications with Russian diplomats, particularly with Count Alexei Volkov, were a clear indication of your involvement. You were facilitating the movement of information and funds, all in the name of Bolshevik interests." Her face reddened, but she didn't speak again. "But," Price said, pausing for effect, "Lady Ashcroft is not the mastermind behind this operation. No, the true orchestrator of this plot is someone far more unassuming." He turned slowly to face Alfred Grayson. The room fell deathly silent as the eyes of all present fixed on the archivist. Grayson's face paled, his eyes darting about the room as though searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. "Mr. Grayson," Price said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension, "you were promised a lucrative reward in exchange for your cooperation. Political asylum, wealth, a new life in exchange for the betrayal of your country." Grayson's hands trembled as he clasped them together in his lap, his lips quivering. He remained silent for a long moment, the guilt mounting in the air like a suffocating fog. Finally, Grayson spoke, his voice barely audible. "It's true," he said. I did it. I stole the plans. I was promised safety, a place in the new order. They said they would take me to Russia, that I would be protected. I didn't think of the consequences. I didn't think of what it would mean for my country." The room remained silent, the weight of his confession sinking in. Price continued, "You thought you could disappear into the shadows, hidden from the law. But your actions have now brought us all to this point." Grayson's shoulders slumped, his face betraying his shame. "The plans, they're already on their way to Russia," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "They were smuggled out last night. They're gone, Inspector. There's nothing you can do now." Price's jaw tightened, but his resolve remained firm. "That remains to be seen," he said quietly. "The plans may be gone, but the men behind this conspiracy are not, and they will pay for what they've done." The guests in the room remained motionless, too stunned to speak. For all the wealth and power they wielded, none could escape the truth that Price had revealed. The hidden ciphers, the secret meetings, the calculated betrayals, all of it had come to light in one dramatic unveiling. Price turned to face the room, his eyes scanning the faces of each of the remaining suspects. "This matter is far from over. The network you've all been part of will be unraveled, piece by piece, until the last of you is held accountable for your actions." As he left the room, the guests remained in stunned silence, the echoes of their betrayal hanging in the air. The shadows of treachery had been cast into the light, and the true cost of their actions was yet to be fully understood. The game had changed. Now it was time to dismantle the network and ensure that no one would escape justice.
Chapter 7. The Race Against Time. The stolen plans were already on their way. There was no time to waste. The final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but they had brought him to the most crucial moment of all. There was no room for error, no more time for hesitation. The stolen naval plans had to be recovered, and the Scotland Yard had to act fast. The Scotland Yard's intelligentsia had tracked the vessel that was taking the plans out of the country. The vessel, a freighter named the Volga, was scheduled to leave the docks at midnight, bound for St. Petersburg. The ship's captain, a man with ties to the Bolshevik network, was unaware that he was being watched. But Price's team had intercepted all communication, and he knew that the ship would make a brief stop before setting sail for international waters. That was where Price would make his move. Price arrived at the docks under cover of darkness, his coat pulled tightly around him as the cold wind whipped through the air. He could see the dim silhouette of the freighter against the misty skyline, its massive hull looming in the distance. Time was slipping through his fingers like sand. He had a narrow window to board the ship, secure the plans, and make sure the Bolshevik agents would not have time to retaliate. Price, along with a small group of Admiralty officers and constables, moved stealthily across the docks, the only sounds the creaking of the wooden planks beneath their boots and the distant splash of the water against the hulls of nearby ships. The plan was simple. Board the ship before it set sail, take control of the cargo hold, and find the stolen plans. The moment came swiftly. As the officers took their positions along the pier, Price approached the side of the Volga, where a small boat was waiting to take him aboard. Aboard the ship, the crew was unaware of the impending confrontation. Price moved through the narrow hallways with precision, his footsteps soundless against the ship's weathered deck. He had already secured the manifest, which revealed that a crate marked "Engineering Equipment" was the one containing the stolen plans. The plan had always been to hide them in plain sight. Who would suspect naval blueprints amidst crates of machinery? Price motioned for his team to split up, each officer positioned at key points along the vessel to ensure no one could escape once the confrontation began. With a steady hand, he reached the cargo hold, where the crate had been stored. It was a large wooden box tucked away in a corner of the hold. With a sharp motion, he pried open the lid and saw, resting inside, the stolen plans. They were rolled tightly, sealed with a wax emblem that bore the mark of the Admiralty. Though the seal had been tampered with, the plans inside remained intact. Just as Price reached for the documents, a voice echoed behind him, low and threatening. "You're too late, Inspector." Price turned sharply to find Alfred Grayson, his face pale and tense, standing in the doorway. A pistol glinted in his hand, and his eyes were wild with desperation. Behind him, a pair of Bolshevik agents flanked him, their eyes cold and calculating. "Grayson," Price said, his voice steady, "it's over. You've lost. You won't get away with this." Grayson's lips twisted into a smile, but it was laced with fear. "I'm not the one who's lost. You think you've won, but you're just another pawn in a much larger game. These plans won't stop anything. They're already on their way to the future. You can't stop the tides of history." "History is written by those who act," Price replied, taking a step forward. "And your part in it ends tonight." Grayson raised the gun, but before he could make a move, Price was already on him, knocking the weapon from his hand with a quick, practiced strike. The sound of the scuffle echoed in the hold, and the two Bolshevik agents lunged at Price, but they were quickly subdued by the officers who had followed him. Grayson struggled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You don't know what you've done," he muttered, his voice trembling. "The plans, everything, they're already in motion. You can't stop it now. The revolution is coming." Price grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward the plans. If the revolution means losing the future of this nation, then I will fight it with everything I have. Grayson's eyes narrowed in defeat as he was cuffed and taken away, his dreams of a new life in Russia slipping through his fingers. With the plans safely secured and the agents apprehended, Price breathed a sigh of relief. They had won. The plans were saved, and Grayson, the man who had betrayed his country for the false promises of political asylum and wealth, was now in custody. As Price watched the officers lead Grayson away, he knew that this chapter had come to a close, but not without its cost. Lady Ashcroft had escaped during the chaos, slipping into the night like a shadow, but Price knew it was only a matter of time before she was found. She had ties to powerful people, but no one could outrun the long arm of the law forever. He made a mental note to ensure that no stone would be left unturned in the hunt for her. The days following the recovery of the plans were filled with official reports, debriefings, and commendations. The Admiralty hailed Price's intellect, his sharp eye for detail, and his unrelenting determination. He had saved the plans and, by extension, the security of the nation. The accolades and praise were endless, but Price remained a man of few words, always careful not to let the spotlight linger on him for too long. Lady Ashcroft, as expected, was apprehended a week later, fleeing the country only to be caught in a small fishing village on the coast. Her arrest, though significant, was just one piece of the larger puzzle. Price knew that the political tensions she had worked to exploit were far from over. The Bolshevik threat was still very real, and the winds of revolution had not yet died down. What had begun as a simple case of stolen plans had become a part of something far larger, a movement, an ideological war that would continue to ripple through Europe for years to come. As the final reports were filed, Price found himself standing by the window of his office, staring out at the skyline. The lights of the city glittered beneath the darkened sky, a city of progress, of change, and of quiet battles fought in the shadows. Price had won this fight, but the shadows of treachery still lingered. The political climate was changing, and the players were shifting. The war for influence, for power, was far from over. Price stood there for a long while, lost in thought. The stolen plans were only a small part of the game, a game that had only just begun. The question now was not whether the Bolsheviks would strike again, but when, and when they did, Price would be ready. For in the shadows, there were always new conspiracies, new betrayals, and new battles to be fought.